So you're going to want to sign in to arcgis.com. You're going to want to go to your content. And so on this video, I'm going to focus on making the dashboard. So I'm not going to go too much into other things. But in order to make a dashboard, you need a base map. And so Tony will more than likely give you the layers for it. But you still need to make sure that you format it to look good, because this will be shown on your dashboard. So for instance, you're going to want to go through your base map, your layer, whatever land cover layer you're using, and you're going to want to format the pop-ups to look good, because when he uploads them, more than likely they'll have like a bunch of decimal places, and also formatting the wording and stuff like that, because the pop-up will be the same on your dashboard. So usually when he tells you to make a dashboard, focus on formatting the base map first. Go through and format all this. But for the sake of this video, I won't show that. I'm just going to focus on making the dashboard. So if you want to make a dashboard for a certain map, you go to that map. Don't open it, but you go to Create Web App, and you go to Dashboard. And so just make sure if you're making a lot of dashboards, you put identifying information to separate them. That way you know the differences. Click OK. And so it's loading. Yeah. So when you first make a dashboard, it'll just show this. It'll just be a map. So the way it works is up here you have an add button, and these are basically all the tools that they currently have that you can add. And then you have your settings. And Tony agrees with me, is dark theme usually is better. We'll do that. And then if you want to, so these settings are for your dashboard, but if you want to alter your map, you use these settings. So you can show pop-ups, you can have a scale bar if you want, you can give access to default extents, you can add a legend, and all this other stuff. But you have to keep in mind when you turn these on, your users will be able to do these things. So like for instance, base map switcher, layer visibility, these are things that you have to consider. Do you want your user to be able to do those things, or will it be too complicated, or things like that? Make sure you save often, pretty much every time after you add an element, make sure you save, otherwise you could lose your stuff. So to start off, if you're making a template from scratch and you're not really sure what you want it to look like, the best thing to do is just add in elements that you know you want, and then iterate with Tony or with your client through maybe what you want the final version to look like. So like I said, we already have a template, so I'm just going to follow that when I'm making this one. So we're going to start off with serial charts. So I have 2 layers here. We're only using one, so if you have multiple layers, just make sure you're using the right layer. So whenever you're making a map element or a dashboard element, it'll always have these on the left-hand side. Typically you want to go in order. So you want to start at data, then you want to go to chart and change that, then and so forth to go to each one. But you don't want to just like skip ahead. So we're going to start in data, make sure you have your right layer. So categories form for serial charts and for pie charts, you're almost always going to want to choose fields. So grouped values only lets you choose one field, and then it uses all the values from one field. Features lets you choose a category field and then a series fields, but for land cover data, we can't really use it based on the way our attribute table is made. Fields is the most generic because you literally choose like one. Okay, that's your first one, and then you go choose your second one. Second one, boom. And then it goes in order. So you choose first, second, third, so forth, and it'll add points for each one of those. So it's the most general use one. Okay, so that's the one we're going to use. So right now I'm doing open water. So we have 74, 85. So my goal here is to make a line chart that's going to have a dot for each year. So we have 85. Now we're going to add 92. Then we had 2001, 11, and then 2016. So we can see we have one for each year, and it looks really bad right now, but we're going to fix that, so that's okay. So, and you can just add as many of those as you want. So if you want, so the filter, basically it is what it is. It is what it says. It's a filter. If, for instance, let's say you notice after you make this, you notice that you're getting negative values. Maybe there's something wrong with the data on the attribute table. Ideally, Tony or someone would fix that in the actual layer itself, but let's say Tony doesn't have time and he tells you, okay, we need it filtered out now. So what you would do is if you're getting negative values, you would go in here, you would go to your whichever one it's happening with, or you could do it to all of them. You can just go to Open Water 74, and then you can say values greater than 0. So you're only going to plot values probably equal to or greater than 0. So no negative values. And you can do that with anything. And then let's say it's happening to multiple fields. You just say and then you do it again for this field. So that way you don't get negative. Like I said, ideally that would be fixed in the layer itself, not here. But if for some reason you need to, you can do it here. So this statistic, so the way line graphs and pie charts work is if you haven't filtered your data, not this filter, I mean on the map, and I'll show that later. If you haven't filtered or selected certain values, what they do is they pull all values from open water. So right, open water has values for every single ecoregion. And so what this statistic does is when you have all those values, it does a certain thing. So right now it's averaging. So this is the average value across all ecoregions for open water 74 right here. So usually you want to leave this on average. You could do like sum, or you could do min or max, but you usually want to leave it on average. And what will happen is when we add in the selector later on, it'll filter your values here to a select county or a select ecoregion or so forth. And then that'll give us what we want with these values. Unfortunately, without the selector, it just kind of averages them or min or maxes them. So usually you just want to leave this alone. So then you go to chart. Here you can change if you want to change your text color, font, if you want it vertical or horizontal. Category axis, this is your x-axis. So obviously this doesn't look really good to say open water here. I would prefer it just to have the years, so I'm going to do that. You just enter it. Just to make it look a little bit better. So now you can see we just have the years here. You can add an axis, so you could say like year here, right? But that's kind of redundant because anyone who looks at this is going to know that it's a year. So we'll just leave that blank. You can turn them off if you don't want them at all. And then of course you can change the rotation. And then this is just changing more visual elements. So your value axis is your y-axis. So on this one we will add, we're going to say acres. And then you can change all these other things. It's best to just play around with it if you really want to know what they do. Then we go to guides. So we're not using guides on this particular project, but I think guides are really cool actually. I think, for instance, if we knew the average value for our change, so like if we took all the changes and we average them, you can actually put that in here. So you can put in a guide and you can say average change for open water, right? And then you can go in here and you can say, let's say it was 8,000. You can add in 8,000 and boom. So I think it's actually a really cool thing that you could use depending on your data. For us, it doesn't really make sense, but to be able to show like maybe an average value so people could look at it and say, oh, okay, that's how far below or above we are. I think it's really cool. Unfortunately, like I said, for the data we have, it doesn't really make sense, but I think it's definitely something to be aware of, guides. And then series. So this is where you're going to do the majority of the work. So we like to use a line because it shows more continuity than a bar. We like to show the labels on it. Hover text basically means if you hover over a point, it'll tell you the value. We leave this on even though the label shows, because sometimes if your value goes higher, it'll get clipped by the box depending on your sizing. So you always want to leave hover on just as a backup if they want to come and look at it. So then the color. So we have a color scheme that we're using, and the best way to do that is so it uses hexes, and it only gives you these select ones, which aren't very varied. So you can use like an online hex selector to get a more like a special color that maybe you can't find in here, and then all you have to do is input your hex symbol. Like for instance, for open water, we use that 476 AAO, and it gives us this nice blue hue that we couldn't get otherwise just using this, right? And the hexes that I'm using on this project, I actually pulled from the map legend itself so that they match. Okay, so we got that, and then you're going to want to go to general. General is always where your title should go. So for this one, this is our open water. And then you could say like lane cover if you wanted, open water lane cover. But I'm just going to leave it as open water for now. And then last updated text. So if you have data that's streaming that gets updated, you're going to want to leave this on at least for a few, because then it'll let someone know, okay, this data is old or this data is up to date. But for us, the data doesn't change, right? Because it's from 1974 to 2016. This isn't going to change, so it's just taking up space. You should make sure you turn that off. No data is basically if for some reason in your data, let's say you select a certain county and there's no data for 1992, if you change this label, this will change what shows up if that happens. So for instance, let's say if you have no data, you want it to say data not available. You can do that. You just have to type it here and then show description. But we don't have to worry about that. So I'll just leave it. And then you can't do actions with these, so that's okay. So your name doesn't show for users. This is for you. I would recommend, so basically I'll show you later on how you use this, but I would always recommend to put some type of descriptor as to what this is. So this is serial chart 1, but it's showing my open water. So I'm going to put open water serial chart. And this will let me know later on how to reference it. And I would always recommend doing that, because if you just leave it as the serial chart 1, you won't know which one it corresponds to, open water, trees, and things like that. So always make sure you do that. And then you're going to want to click done. So now that you have one of your serial charts made, you can go ahead, and if you hover over your left here, you'll have drag item, configure, duplicate, and delete. These all pretty much do what you think. You can drag to another side, place it like that. But we're going to want to duplicate, and this gives us the exact same chart. And then what we're going to want to do is now maybe do it for developed. So you'll change all these values to developed. Okay, and you can see it kept everything. It kept all of our formatting. We did lose the formatting here on the bottom because our names were regenerated. So we're going to have to fix those. It's pretty simple. So you're going to want to reset those. And then you notice, oops, sorry, that one didn't reset. You'll notice that the two things left are we're still under the same color. And we also have open water up here, even though we are now developed. So we're going to want to change those. So if we go to series, we'll get the color here. And so like I said, if you already have a hex, because you want to make sure you use consistent colors, you'll just put it here. Whoops. See the red that we used for developed. And like I was saying earlier with the hover text and labels, is you can see that this value isn't being shown, and that's because the box isn't big enough. You can see if we enlarge it, it'll be shown, but for instance, if maybe it's too small, you can't, and that's why you want to leave hover text on, so that your user can always find the value, even if it's not shown. And then of course we want to change this to developed, and then done. And you can see now we have our developed. So you can take these. And so there's two ways of moving items. So you can take this and you can put it here. And you see you have this black separator line here. So in some instances you might want this black separator. For instance, between the map and the line charts, it's a nice separation, right? But between the line charts themselves, it's kind of it's just taking up space. It's not continuous. So what you can do is you can drag and you can press shift. You'll see it'll turn green, and then you can do this. And you can see we get rid of that space. And also now these are grouped as a single item, and we can drag them together instead of having to drag them separately. And so if you ever have something with a bunch of similar elements, you'll always want to do that shift and drag and group them. So you can see these are grouped now, and we're good to go. So make sure you always do that if you're ever doing a bunch of indicators or a bunch of line charts or anything like that. So now that you have made, like I said, your first line chart, you'll just want to go through duplicating and doing that for each set of land values. So open water, developed, trees. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to the next part. Now, one thing I do want to mention that's particular to this data is that if we look at crops and pasture and hay, so if you look at 1974, we have pasture, hay, and crops, all one layer. If you look at 85, we have the same thing, all one layer. But once you get to 1992, pasture and hay and crops become two separate layers. And that's the same onward until 2016. It's all separated. So because of this division and how it was done, what we do for these serial charts is we only show from 1992 onward, we show them separated. So we'll have one line chart for pasture and hay from 1992 to 2016, and then we'll have another line chart for crops from 1992 to 2016. And so that's how we get around the fact that in the 85 and 71 they were combined, because there's no way to plot that. So that's one thing worth noting about those two particular line charts. So I'll go ahead and make both of those, and then we'll be good. So we just wrapped up our serial charts. So now we're going to move on to our pie charts. And you don't have to go in this specific order. I'm just doing it in this order because I think making the charts is the easiest part. Making the indicators is a bit more tedious, so I like to save that to the end, but you can do it in any order you want. So we're just going to click pie chart, and then pretty similar to the serial chart, we're just going to click the layer we want. And you follow pretty much the same thing. So you check you got your layer. You then notice that you have very similar selections as you had in the serial chart. And we're going to stick with fields again. And they work the same as they did in the serial chart. For instance, if we click this one, it'll pull all the data from one attribute, but we want to pull from multiple, so we're going to use fields. So the first pie chart we're going to make is the 1974, and we will just be putting in all the land covers for that year. So we'll start with open water and just go down the list. I think that's all of them, so just double check. Open water developed. Yep. So that's all of them. So once again, like I discussed on the serial chart, we have the issue with if they haven't selected a specific county or ecoregion or watershed or what have you, then it'll average or whatever we choose, some standard deviation of all the values. So we're going to stick with average again here, just because it'll show reasonable values before they select. So move down to chart. Here, so for our pie charts, as you notice, you can have labels, but you also have hover text available. And you can also even do a legend. As you see here, you can do a legend. We have opted just for the hover text. This is mainly because we have so many categories that the legend is just too big. And also we're not trying to draw, the pie chart is really just a visual aid for the percentages because we're showing these percentages anyway on our indicators. So the pie chart is just a visual aid for that. So we're really not worried about having all this other stuff listed, especially when you can see these aren't even showing up. We would really have to expand it for everything to show up. And we're not really willing to give it that space on the dashboard. We'd rather focus on other things. So we're going to hide. We're not going to use a legend. We're also not going to use labels. We're just going to use hover text. So this is what the user will see. And then if they want to see specific values, they can hover over it. So that's what we've chosen to do. So then you move on to slices once you have that set up. And this is very similar to the line chart. You're going to want to type what you want them to see. So you'll notice if I hover over a certain one, Forest 1974, Developed 1974, they don't need to see that because we're going to put up here at the top, we're going to put land cover for 1974. So this whole pie chart will be for 1974. They don't need that on the indicator. It's just taking up extra space. So we're just going to go through and shorten these and get rid of the year. And also add dashes or spaces to the description if it's needed. Such as with pasture-ready crops, you want to add in a dash between each of those. Get rid of the years. And then once again with the colors, we want all of our colors to be consistent across the entire dashboard. So using our color values from before, oops, change that one. I'm going to move that to the side just so it's quicker. Barren land. Forest. And this is really what takes the longest on the pie charts because you have to go through every single value for each pie chart, which you'll see. And maybe they'll change that with a future update because right now, if we come back, even if we duplicate this exact pie chart after we color it, when we duplicate it and select the new layers, it'll reset the coloring, which is very time consuming to do over and over again, as you can see. So maybe they'll update that in the future. I know they're still playing around a lot with that type of stuff. So I'm trying to remember. For now, we'll just put land. I can't remember the one I used in the past, but You'll want to make sure you keep this consistent across all the dashboards if you're making multiple. And like I mentioned, we don't need the last updated text, and then we don't have any actions here, so we'll click done. And that's our pie chart. That's what it looks like. You can hover over the text. So we'll move this down here for now. And then like with the serial charts, you'll want to come here. You're going to want to duplicate. And then you're going to want to go to the next year. So 1985 for each value. And you can see it's reverting the colors, like I said, so we'll have to redo that, but that's okay. And you'll just go through and update each value to the next year. And you'll do this for each one until 2016. And if you remember on the serial charts for pasture hay crops, we opted to not include 74 and 85, but for the pie charts, we just include all the values for each year. So after 85, from 92, 2001, 2011, 2016, they'll have one more, they'll have 8 category fields because they'll have pasture hay and then they'll have crops. But that's okay, you'll just include that anyway and keep the coloring consistent, as I said. So then, luckily, it doesn't revert the chart changes. So once you duplicate, all you have to do is update your data and then come to slices, update these, and then update your header. And you just have to change the year here, so 85. And then update all of these once again. And then once again, do these colors. There we go. Click done. And so I'm gonna double check something. Okay. So the way we do pie charts is we just do what's called stacking, and I'll show you that. So for these line charts, serial charts, we group them. And grouping still shows all elements, as you can see. But stacking is basically another way of grouping. So what you'll do is you'll do the drag item and you'll just carry it and you'll do this middle one and it'll show stack the items. Now you don't want to shift this because if you do, it won't let you stack because shifting is something else. So you'll just want to come and stack. And what you'll notice is you get these tabs at the bottoms for each one. Now, every time you add a new one, it automatically puts it on the last tab to the right. So for instance, if we want to show this from newest year, 2016, all the way to the last year, or the oldest, 74, you're going to have to come in here and rearrange them. So now we have 85, 74, and then we'll do the rest on the left. And then clicking this, you can update this tab, and you can just put the year, and this is what your user will see. When they come in, they'll see 1985. And then on this one, we'll put 1974, and then so forth, and do the others. Now that we've completed the serial and pie charts, we're going to move on to the indicators. As I've previously mentioned, the indicators by far take the most time with this dashboard, simply because we have so many of them. We have an indicator for each lane cover set, as well as each year within each set. So as you can tell, that's well over 30 indicators. And also the indicator in general takes a lot more work to make for each one as compared to either of these two, simply because we have reference values and formatting and things of that sort. So we'll go ahead and jump on into the indicators. Go up here, indicator, and then as with all of them, just make sure you select the corresponding layer, and then it'll bring you to this page. And right away you'll notice it looks very different from the other two, which are fairly similar. We only have 3 properties here, and as well as this page looks fairly different from the other two. So what you'll want to do is we'll be using a feature, and we're just going to start off with forest, and we'll start in 1974, the first year. And as you can tell, we have a very large number and a lot of decimal places, but we'll take care of that in a minute. So something that separates indicators from the other two elements that we had, serial charts and pie charts, is, as you'll remember I mentioned, when we add the selector and the user selects a specific region, it'll update all of our elements to that specific region. And I mentioned that with the other two, we would set average, if you remember correctly, down in the value type, because when nothing was selected, it would just show the average of all values, of all counties, of all ecoregions, and so forth. But indicators do not do that. What indicators do is they will only ever show the value for a specific county, region, what have you. And that's what you see here. This is why we have 1 of 50. It's because right now it is not selected a specific one, so it's showing all. So we have to account for that. So the way we account for that is, first of all, down here on maximum displayed, you're going to want to make that to show all. So I believe we have around 69 or 89 or something like that. Here we can just put in 100 and see. So you can see I put 99 and it shows 96. That means we have 96 total ecoregions. So for each indicator, we're going to want to make sure we can just put 100 here just to cover our bases. You're going to want to make sure you put that. Otherwise, when nothing is selected, we'll only be showing a lesser amount, and we don't want that. Secondly, you're going to want to sort it by name. So these have multiple layered names because we have multiple layers here, but on like, for instance, counties, you would just select county name or so forth. So here I'll do L1 key. And what that does is it puts them in order of whichever one you select, either ascending or descending. It's whichever you prefer. Secondly, as we discussed, we want to show percentage values. So this is our acreage value, so we want to show percentage as well. And that's what this reference type is for. It's for you to show an additional set. So we'll go here, we'll go to feature. And since we did forest 1974, we're going to go to the corresponding percent value. So we'll come to percent forest 1974. Now we have a percentage. And that's good to go with our data box. So now we'll move over to the indicator. So the way this works is you have a lot of freedom to really move the things around. So for instance, element value is your main element value, forest 1974. Element reference is your reference value, which is our percentage. So if you wanted to show for them like that, for instance, you could just do that. And you can find other fields here. So you can also include many other things. You could include some other value if you wanted, although I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. But it's there if you're interested in playing around with it. So we like to store percentage on the bottom. And up here, we actually will put forest. We won't put the year because we'll be listing the year in the bottom of this stack, because we'll actually be stacking these by year. So yeah. Another thing is this lets you set the size. So we go for medium, mediums. We go for small, medium, small. So we set our main acreage to medium because that's what we want to highlight. And then we put what it is and our percentage values and the small font. And then we're going to want to type in what these are. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to format these numbers. Obviously, we don't want to be giving 20 decimal places. We only really want to show one or maybe even none. It would be up to whoever you're making this for what they want. But I like to show one here. So the way this works is right now you go under formatting value, it's default. And default is it's just going to show as much as it can. So if in your layer on your base map it has 50 decimal places, it will try to show 50 decimal places. Obviously we don't want that, so this is where we change it. So the way this works is you put in a pattern of the number you want. And you can do that by either doing a hashtag or by entering a 0. The difference between a hashtag and a 0 is a hashtag is a specific number spot, but if it is a 0, it will not show. If it can be rounded off, it'll round off. Whereas a 0 will show the number, so 1 through 9, but if it is a 0, it will show it. So for instance, if we do 0.0, even if our land cover is 0, it will still show 0.0, 0.0. Whereas if we did hashtag.hashtag, and we had a land cover that had 0 acres, 0%, it would not show. It would just be a blank. And we don't want that because then our user would be very confused as to what that means. So what we want to do, and make sure you make it large enough so that any number you could possibly have would fit. So for that I do upwards of 100 million, as you can see. So 3 hashtags, comma, 3 hashtags, comma, 2 hashtags, and then a 0.0. And this is, as I discussed, no matter, even if the number we have is 0, it'll show 0.0. And that's what we want, because if it just showed blank, our user would not understand what that means. And then there you go. You can see now we have the number with 1 decimal place. And you're going to have to set this for each indicator box, but if you duplicate, it should cover over. So that's good. Lastly, so Tony did not specifically ask for icons, but I implemented them and he liked them. So the reason we implemented an icon is because, for instance, if I publish this, and let's move it over where we might have it. So let's say we had something like this. Our user can look at this, and he can tell, okay, green is forest, if they look at it one time. You don't necessarily need to list forest, although we do, but we don't need it because they could tell. You need it in one spot, obviously, but if you have all consistent coloring, they can know, right? They look at the color, they say, okay, that color was for open water, or that color was for wetlands. And so you want to implement that coloring in every element if you can. And so with the indicator box, you have 2 options for that. One thing you could do is you can color these letters. So I could make this number green, for instance. I could match this green. But then you're going to have a rainbow of colors for numbering. And that doesn't really look professional or appeasing. Like, it doesn't look very good if I make this green and then all the other ones are different colors. It looks a little unprofessional. So the way to get around that is you can add an icon. Here, you can add it on the left side or the right side. It'll put it either here or here. So we'll go for the left side. And this is for forest. So if you have your own, you can upload your own, but they have plenty if you just go through them. And so what I did originally was I just went through and I looked for a generic one that would work for each category. So for forest, for instance, I would just use a tree, a literal tree. You just have to look through and find one that suits your needs. And there's multiple options, so just playing around and finding one that you think works for you. So here, yep, tree. And so not only visually does this tell them tree, but what we do on top of that is I match the color. So I go and I grab my forest hex, and put it here, and boom. Even if the icon is a little ambiguous, as you'll see moving forward with some of the ones we have, for instance, like for crops, someone might not look at the icon and say, oh yes, that represents crops. they can look at the color, and the color will tell them, based on the continuity with the rest of the elements, they'll say, oh, okay, yes, I know that is crops or wetlands or what have you. And that's the icon. That's how we do our icons. So then we'll come over here to general. We don't use a title because we just input what it is within the indicator. But we do want to get rid of the last update, as we said. And well, I'll wait on that till later. But so yes, this is our indicator. This is the template. So we make that. It actually needs to be on the far right, outside of these two. And then we'll come and do this indicator for each type of land cover, and we'll put them underneath each one. So now we'll move to developed. So you'll do duplicate as usual. So you'll need to update both your main field and your reference field. So we'll do developed 74 and then % developed 74. Luckily, it holds your sort and it holds your max features, so you don't have to reset those. You go over to indicator. You just need to change from forest to your new developed. It'll hold these, so you don't have to fix those, and it'll hold your pattern as well. However, you will need to update your icon. So for us, what we use for developed is simply this icon, which shows some buildings and some people. And as I said, we didn't have to. This was just what I thought best represented it. The main point, the key point, is that you consistently color, which is what I'll do with this hex. We get our red color in there, and then that's it. And so drag it, and you'll want to shift, because we're going to want to group these, and you'll group it on the bottom. And there you go. And as you can see, even if I didn't list developed or forest here, you could simply look at this coloring in the icon and you could infer, okay, that's developed. Even if the icon is a little ambiguous, like I said, the coloring consistency is key. And we'll save that. And then you'll go through and do this for each of your indicators, updating your icons and your fields referenced. When you first go through and select the icons, like I said, if you decide to use them, just choose what you think best represents what you're trying to convey. And there you go. Now you have all your elements. So you'll just want to go through and try to make them similar sizing. It can take a little bit of time. And keep in note, if you do this on a larger screen, someone on a smaller screen, it might not work out too well because the scaling will be weird. So whenever you're scaling, try to use a smaller screen or make your window smaller if you just have a really big screen or a monitor, and then that'll be equivalent. So there we go. And so one thing you'll notice is when I made the land cover for the pie charts, if you remember, when we inputted the layers, we did them in order as they were listed here. We just did open water, developed, in the direct order they're listed. But you'll notice I didn't do that here. I did them out of order. And the reason behind that is they're in order of importance, sort of, from top to bottom. The two things we care about the most are forest and developed. And then probably something that we care about the least is barren land, so that's why it's towards the bottom. Debatably, we should Oh, you made a mistake here. This should be wetlands. Debatably, wetlands should be underneath developed, but if we change that later on, we can just move them. But you should try to put them in a good order, because obviously we don't want barren land at the top, because that's probably the one people don't care about too much, and open water and so forth. But of course, work with Tony on that. And then now you can see what I mean. For instance, someone might not look at this symbol and say that means barren land, but by color, they can say, oh, it's gray, barren land, and so forth. Whereas some symbols do line up, like trees, open water, and wetlands, I think have very corresponding icons, but it would depend on what type of land cover or project you're doing. Now that we have finished this set, one thing that's worth noting is just by looking at this, you cannot tell this what year this is. And as I said, we'll go to the next year. So this is 1974. So we're going to do 85 and stack it. And while the bottom indicator will look like this, and it will say 2016 or so forth, I would still like to include some other indicator, preferably higher up, because people's eyes will tend to go towards the top of a list. And so what we'll do is we'll go in specifically to our forest tab, and we'll add an indicator that states what year or what specifically this data is referring to. So we'll go to configure. We're here on forest. We'll go to general. We'll go to title. You're going to want to center it, and we'll just do 1974. So now anyone who looks at this list can see at the top the year, 1974. And it kind of naturally corresponds downward. And one thing worth mentioning is this arrow, this 1 of 96, this will disappear once we add in our selector, because once they select a specific ecoregion, it will filter this list, and so there will only be one shown, and it'll get rid of this. So it'll look much nicer once we start filtering. But now that we have completed the tier list for 1 year, we're going to do the other years. What you'll want to do is copy each one respectively, and then just update it to the next year. Because since forest does have the slight formatting change, if you just try to copy one for all of them, you'll have to go back and add this. So it's better to make the next forest do forest and then developed and so forth. So go ahead, copy a couple. And I like to just go ahead, copy them, set them up, and then change the years. I think it's quicker than trying to pull them up one by one, change them, and then stack them. I think stacking them, making them, stacking them, and then going back is the best method. It'll be nice if in the future they, like I said, this software is fairly new and they're still updating a lot of basics on it. Potentially they might have a way where you can save a template for a dashboard and then just update the layers. That would be really nice. Or even if they make it to where you can copy a group, and it copies every element in that group instead of having to do this each time. So I'm going to move this over, not on top of, but next to our first one. And the reason I do this is so we can line up their layers. So start from the top and just line up each one with their respective line on the first one. Because you want, as best you can, you want your, so when people are shifting from one to another, it's not, you know, if they're uneven, it'll be obvious. Now, like with the other things, you have to keep in mind that after 1985, we'll have one extra indicator because pasture, hay, and crops will be separate. So you have to keep that in mind, that after these two, we'll have to fit in another indicator here. So got it lined up. So now I'm just going to drag group and put it on top like we did with the pie charts. And then down here, we have it at the bottom. So I'll make this one 1974. This one will be 1985, and then we'll go change the years for these. Whoops. So now you'll notice we have drag group and drag stack. So if you want to move this entire thing, you'll do drag stack Otherwise, it'll remove it from the stack. So we'll just come in here. We're going to go to 1985. Everything else remains the same. We just need to update our header or title. And there we go. And you can go double check. You can see we lost a couple acres. We dropped from 67 to 62%. But that's all we have to update for these, is just the layers, and then for the forest we have to do the title, but other than that, that's it. So once you get the first set of indicators made, updating the rest isn't too difficult. You just have to do a lot of duplicating and a lot of stacking, and that's why it takes so long. And you always want to cross-check your numbers just to make sure you didn't make a mistake when you were updating them. 85. And now that we have these two, we're going to move on to 96. And then, like I said, for 96, here we only have 7 indicators. We'll have 8 from here on out, so keep that in mind. And of course, as we say with consistency, you're always going to want to keep this order: forest, developed, open water, and so forth. So since we're adding in one and it's crops, we're going to put crops right underneath pasture and hay, because that makes the most sense in terms of keeping the continuity. And I'll show you how I'm going to do that in a second. So since we have an additional one for pasture, hay, and for crops, you'll notice that if you look here, we just use a slightly, pasture hay is this brown golden color. So for crops, we've just been using a more yellow-ish version of that color. So we use the same symbol, but we just change the color. So since we do that, we're just going to copy the pasture hay crops twice and put it underneath itself. And then this one will be our crops, this one will be our pasture hay. So we're going to move this over to the right side. And then, oh, I made a mistake. Got to remember to grab the group. And then remember we have one extra here, so they'll all be slightly smaller. But you'll notice I'm making forest the same size, and that's because forest has an additional amount of text, so it needs to be larger. So I'll take the height away from my other layers if I can. As you can see, I'm making them slightly smaller to fit that extra layer. Too small. So gotta cut back on them a little bit. And then, like I said, if you think it's too small, you can always come back and resize some later. So now stack it. This is 1992. Okay. Now we'll go through and update them. You can see we gained a couple acres that year. So for this one will be our pasture hay. So not only will we need to update our layers, we will need to update our header. So we'll go to indicator and we'll just remove crops. Pasture hay. Now this one will be the opposite, it'll be the crops. So we'll just need to update the header again appropriately. And then also, as I said with the color, I'm just using one that we picked from here, slightly more of a golden. You can tell the difference here. Just once again for the color continuity across elements. And then the rest will be the same. So now that you've done these three, doing the remainder of the years from 2001, 2011, 2016 is the same process. But then we do need to make a change indicator, which I'll do last. So I'll go ahead and finish the remaining years, and then we'll look at the change indicator. So now that we've made the indicators for each set of years, you just want to go through, like I said, and just double check that there's some consistency and change throughout the years. And then if you have 2 years that there's no change, just double check that you did the corresponding layers, because sometimes it's easy to miss an indicator or to accidentally not click the right layer that you're looking for. So now we need to do the change indicator. And so for that, you're going to want to use duplicate template from 85 or 74, because for the change values, pasture hay crops is all one attribute. It's not separated like in these years 1992 to 2016. It's not separated. So you're going to want to use 74 or 85, and you're just going to want to duplicate those indicators like we've been doing. Then like we've been doing, you want to size them up. And then stack that. And we're going to make the change group our far left group. And you're just going to want to label this one change. And in parentheses put the abbreviated years. Like that. And you'll notice now your tabs at the bottom of your indicator, it's gotten too wide for this element. And that's okay. We expect this to happen, and the way that works is your user will now just have to use these arrows. Still pretty straightforward, so we're not too worried about that being too complicated, but there's nothing you can do. And if you view this on a small enough screen, it'll do the same for the pie charts, because once we final scale this, we'll probably make our line charts a bit bigger and make the map a bit smaller, because for this dashboard, the map isn't our centerpiece. Our centerpiece is really focusing on the serial charts and the indicators. But the indicators are just naturally, they can be smaller because it's just a set of numbers. Whereas the line charts we want to be a bit bigger. So now we'll go through and update these. So you'll just find the forest change. So depending on what project you're working on, be careful. Sometimes there might be intermediate year change, but we don't want that. So forest change 74 2016, and then like always you want your corresponding percent value, and then we're going to want to change this to 1974-2016. You can include change here if you want, but for now I'm just leaving it as such. And you'll do the same for each of your indicator boxes. And there we have it. So we've completed almost every element of this dashboard. Now we need to move into the functionality and with the selection and making that. So we'll want to go up to add an attribute, and you're going to want to add header. And so for now we'll just leave this as is, and we'll just click done. And you can see it puts your header up here at the top. Now if you go to the far left of the header, you have configure. And you have a couple of other options here. You have 3 types of selectors: category, number, and date. So depending on what you're trying to show with your data, you could use any one of these. For us, we do have date data, but our date data isn't intrinsically part of the attribute table. It is just, it's just we have layers that represent dates, but we don't necessarily have dates within our attributes. So we're just going to do category. And so we're going to want to do features, as always. We're going to want to do it for the layer we've been using. Defined values means you can input values. They don't necessarily have to be within your data, but then of course it wouldn't work, so you have to be careful with that one. And grouped values is what we've dealt with, where it's a singular layer. So for line text item, this is how your user will be able to filter the data. So if you want them to filter, so like I've said, on this echo region, we have 4 layers of names. But for instance, if you were doing counties here, you would just select county name. Or if you were doing watersheds, you would just do watershed name, or whatever you want your user to use. Obviously, your average user will know county names. They won't know county IDs. So you wouldn't want to do county IDs in that case. So for this dashboard, it's a little special because we're probably going to end up doing 4 selectors to where our user can select the upper layer, the lower layer, and so forth if they so please, or if they want, they can just go straight to the L1 layer. So for now, we're just going to do L1, and you can see over here on the right, this is what it'll look like. Our user will have this drop down where they can select, actually, sorry, I may have made a mistake. I think it's L4. See what happens. Yeah, so our user, we're going to give them access to L4. So L4 is the lowest layer, meaning it is the most accurate, whereas L1 is the overburden layer, the upper layer, if you will. So like I said with our previous thing, we want to show all our categories, so I'll do 500, and I'm sure we don't have more than that. It looks like we do not. And then sort. And then, as I've said, we'll do L4 ascending. And so if you'll remember earlier when I did this for the indicators, I did it by L1. So I'm going to go back and change that because I was mistaken. We need to do L4. And so your label, you can see here when I type, it just shows on the left. So you'll just want to tell your user what this is. So I'll do echo region, echo regions. So as I said, we might do multiple selectors. So the way that would work is we'll do this one and it'll have all these. And then if we want to, we can make another selector for L3 layers. And then what the user can do is select an L3 and it'll filter these L4s that are within that L3. I'm not sure if we'll do that yet, but if we do, that's simply how it will work. And then all these others, so operator, basically this is saying if our user selects this one, for instance, our operator will be equal to that. Whereas you can do the reverse where you do not equal, and so your user can select one and then it shows everything but that one. That one's not quite as intuitive, so we're going to do equal, drop down, that's how this menu works. And then you're going to want to do a none option. And the reason you want to do this is if you don't do a none option, as you can see, it'll just automatically show the upper one. And we don't want to do that because that'll trick our user into thinking that one is what is selected. However, that won't be the case because the user hasn't selected it. The user actually does need to go in and click on it even if it's shown when they first open the tab. So to fix that, we're going to show none so the user knows that none is selected and they need to pick one. Just to make it more straightforward. So we'll click done and save. And so now you can see we have the selector here. Let's go in and click. And you can see nothing happens. And that is because you need to configure actions. And what actions are basically when you select with this, it does something. So let's go in. So you can see you have a couple options. So filter, flash, pop-up, pan, and zoom. So pop-up is, as what it says, if you have show pop-up, what will happen is if I click Inner Plains Piedmont on my selector, it'll show the pop-up for that region on my map. Now, I actually don't want to do this, but it is pretty useful, so if you think it's worth doing, that's how you do it. However, for our map, we're not doing that because if our user wants to use a pop-up, they can, but we're doing that with most of our elements showing the data. So what I will want to do is flash, pan, and zoom. And what these will do is when our user selects a certain region, it will flash, as you see, pan and zoom to it. And flash, basically, as you'll see, it just flashes it with a highlight. So let's do sandhills. And you can see there, it's flashing and it's hovering over. Now, after the flash is gone, it's kind of difficult for our user to say, oh, that's where, it's kind of difficult to see where that is exactly. So one more thing I'm going to want to do is go in here and add a filter. And I'm going to want to target the map and the layer that we are using. And what that'll do is it'll remove the other layers and only show the one we're on. And you can see that's much easier after the flash is finished. Our user can still see what they're looking at. Now you can see it zoomed out actually, and that's because it's a larger region here. If we choose a smaller region, it'll zoom in, as you can see. And then if we go back up to none, we're back where we started. So you'll notice that even though we're choosing and selecting, none of our values or tables are updating. And that's, once again, that's with the filter. So what you need to do is if you want something to update based on your selection, it'll need to be a target within your filter. And you can see we have a lot. We have 53 indicators, and then we have our serial charts, as well as our pie charts. And we're going to want to add all of those as targets. And of course, if you had a specific one where maybe you wanted it to remain stagnant and not be affected by this particular selector, all you would need to do is not include it within this filter action. One thing is you do need to be careful of overlapping actions. So you might have noticed when we were making our other elements, most of them had an actions tab, and we just kind of ignored it at the time. You can induce actions through other elements as well, not just a selector, but you really need to be careful because if you have multiple things that can be used as filters per se, it'll overlap and cause some issue, especially your user might become easily confused as to why certain things aren't available. So you really need to limit it to maybe one or two action areas. Otherwise, you're just going to start overlapping and it'll be too confusing. And you can see here what I was talking about towards the beginning of the video when we made our serial charts. You see how all of these just say indicators 51, 50, 49. I don't know what these are specifically. I don't know if this is the 1974 open water or if it's the Forest 2016. I have no idea. But you can see the one that we did label, like I said you should do, we can easily see, oh, this is the open water serial chart. So we know specifically which serial chart this is. And that's why I say you should do it for all of them. You'll notice I didn't do it for the rest of them. And that was to show you why you should do it. Because when we look through these, we have absolutely no idea what they correspond to. We know this is a pie chart, but we have no idea which pie chart it is. And so you should always, like I said, name them appropriately. Open water serial chart, open water pie chart, indicator 1974 open water. You should always label them appropriately because if you do have some that you want to have an action and some that you don't, it would be impossible to do it this way. Luckily for us, with this format on our dashboard, we do want all of them to be affected, so it's not a huge deal, but you should always keep in mind to label them appropriately. It'll just make things simpler in the future if you ever want to change anything or something similar. So we'll click done and we'll save. And then now we can test it out. So we'll come and we'll choose one. And you can see everything just updated. So what you'll want to do, just to make sure everything's working, is you'll want to go through and change your selector and look at every tab and make sure everything is updating. Sometimes there will be an error, especially since we're using so many elements and we're having an action on all of them. There could be an error, and the only way to catch that would be to make sure everything is updating. So for instance, look at your serial charts, pick a random one, and just make sure they all change their values. Same thing with your pie charts, just make sure they're all updating. Oh, and here we go. This looks like an error here. Oh, that's interesting. As you can see, this particular ecoregion is within a river, it looks like. And you can see that basically all of our values are 0 except for open water because it's in a river. And so that's something kind of interesting. So what you might want to do in this case, for instance, is of course talk to Tony, see what he thinks, but it might be worth filtering this particular ecoregion, because if your user stumbled across this, they might be extremely confused. They would be like, okay, this dashboard is broken. Even though, I can look at this and I can say, oh, that's on a river, the average user might not figure out instantly what that means, and you don't want to cause that confusion. So it's worth maybe filtering this out. And the way you would do that is you would just go to Configure, Filter, you would go L4 key, and you would select the one that you want to filter out, equal, and then filter that one. And then you can just and do it for any others that you find that maybe equal that. I'm going to, of course, consult Tony first, but that's definitely something you should consider. And so I'll just write down the name of that particular ecoregion. Okay. And so once you've done that, some things you might want to consider is when your user first opens this dashboard, you can see that our header is the same color as all the other elements, so it kind of blends in. So maybe we want to draw some attention to our header, so we can maybe think about making it pop a little more by changing the color. So let's go for a light gray. And then also, I'm going to put in some specific text here to draw the user to my selector, because unfortunately we can't change the location of the selector. So it's always on the far right side. So I want to draw my user's attention to that, because that's the main element of our dashboard, is being able to select. So to update land cover data, select. And you can see now when our user looks at this, it tells them exactly what to do and points them to the selector. So even if a user has never used a dashboard in their life, they can look at this and read it. And you can see with the new color, it really draws your attention here before here. And so they'll see this and they'll say, oh, okay, I need to do this. And now that we've completed all the main elements of the dashboard, there is a couple more things to consider. One of these is that currently, outside of the selector, our user really has no way of telling what data is being shown for what county, or sorry, what ecoregion. And even with the selector, you can see it doesn't show the full name or full name of the ecoregion. So we want to consider how to include that into our dashboard to where it's more obvious. We could include it, for instance, under each title. You know that if you remember that was an option, we can include name reference, but it'd be kind of small, and also we can't include it on the indicators because, as we said, it's already so cluttered with all of the information. We don't want to include anything else. So one way to get around this is by using a list. And so a list is actually meant to be a replacement for the selector that we're using. The way a list works is you're able to come in here and you are able to list all of the options, and then like with a selector, you give it the action to when your user selects one or multiple, it'll filter the data. The reason we don't use list in that way and we use a selector is because a selector takes up much less space on your dashboard, whereas a list would have to be included with your other elements and it takes up a lot of space. It might be worth considering if we didn't have as many elements as we do, but we don't use it in that way. And so the way I found to use it was by making the maximum features 1, and by reorganizing it, we can repurpose it as so. So we could say data being, and we could do something similar to this, to where now our user can see which specific ecoregion the data is coming from. So simply by doing that, we go to list. This are your indicators. You can choose whichever. So if you're doing counties, you would simply choose name, but for us, we're L4 key. And then maybe change the font to bring a little bit of highlight to specifically what we're showing. And then of course, sort by ascending to match. Remove last updated. Click done. And I would like to show this at the top so that our user can instantly see it. So I'm going to choose to put it above our line charts. And so now our user can see which specific region is being shown. And so of course we're going to want to go into our selector and add this list as a target for filter. So now we can see Sand Hills, and we can see data being shown for Sand Hills. So our user can easily see outside of the selector what is being shown. And that pretty much completes this dashboard. Once again, like I said, you'll want to go through and resize everything. It can take a couple of iterative processes to make sure everything's sized accordingly. And also you'll want to go through and double check all the indicators and the numbers. So for instance, one way to do that is click filter to a select entity and then look at your values and make sure they line up. So for 2016 forest, 914, 914K. We can see that matches up, and so forth, and just do that for everything and make sure each element is being affected by the filter. And also it's a good way to just make sure that your data is good, because sometimes there could have been an error with performing calculations. So the best way to catch that is to go through and then you'll be able to immediately tell, oh, okay, this number doesn't line up, or something similar. And maybe one final note, as I mentioned, you have to be careful with overlapping actions. That is true also for like map actions. For instance, we could set it to where, so you can do something when map extent changes. So if your user zooms in on the map, you could set it to filter what's available. But you don't want to do this because it can be a little confusing if your user accidentally zooms in and then all of a sudden they can't find certain certain places to filter to. It's best just to leave the filtering to one element. And also, you can kind of tell here that our map isn't sitting well within our boundaries here. So we can actually update that by going into your base map and changing your boundary extents. That's the best way to update that.